tragedies of welfare in America today. And I don't believe the stereotype after what we did of people in need who are there simply because they prefer to be there. We found the overwhelming majority would like nothing better than to be out with jobs, with a future, and out here in the society with the rest of us. The trouble is, again, that bureaucracy has them so economically trapped that there's no way they can get away. And they're trapped because that bureaucracy needs them as a clientele to preserve the jobs of the bureaucrats themselves. I believe there are programs like that, programs like education, others that should be turned back to the states and the local communities with the tax sources to fund them and let the people close the government. I believe in states' rights. I believe in people doing as much as they can for themselves at the community level and the private level. And I believe that we've distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended in the Constitution to that federal establishment. And if I do get the job I'm looking for, I'm going to devote myself to trying to reorder those priorities and to restore to the states and local communities those functions which properly belong there. I'm going to try also to change federal regulations and a tax structure that has made this once great, powerful industrial giant in this land, in the world, now with a lower rate of productivity than any of the other industrial nations, with a lower rate of savings and investment on the part of our people, and put us back where we belong. Now I just want to conclude with a couple of words.
That was our former president, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Yes, this week was his birthday, which would have been his, I guess, 113th birthday. So I thought it was no better time. There's no better time to bring back one of our reoccurring segments to talk about the legacy of the 40th president. He is one of America's greatest villains. Yes. So how do you become one of America's greatest villains? Is it something you're born with? Is there anything in his background that would have said that he would have caused the type of damage and destruction that he ended up causing as the president of the United States? Well, let's just see. He was born on February the 6th, 1911 in Tampico, Illinois. Yes, he was from Illinois. The youngest son of Nellie Clyde and Jack Reagan. Now, his mom was a very religious woman. She was committed to a religious sect called the Disciples in Christ. His father did his best to provide for the family, but was an alcoholic. And so because of this, the family moved around a lot. They used to live in Chicago, Galesburg, and Monmouth before returning to Tampico in 1920. They actually settled in Dixon, Illinois, which is where Ronald Reagan went to high school. At Dixon High School, he developed interest in drama and football. And in 1928, at the age of 17, he started going to Eureka College. Now, in college, he was a mediocre student, that participated in campus politics. He actually was the student body president. Yes, and joined a student strike that resulted in the college president's resignation. He obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics and sociology from Eureka College in 1932. After this, he took a job in Davenport, Iowa as a sports broadcaster for 4 football games in the Big Ten Conference. He then worked for WHO Radio in Des Moines and as a broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs. I had no idea Reagan worked for the Cubs. Did not know that. In 1936, while traveling with the Cubs to their spring training in California, Reagan took a screen test that led to a 7-year contract with Warner Brothers. Must have been a really good screen test. From here, he arrives in Hollywood in 1937, debuting in Love is on the Air. He used a simple and direct approach to acting and followed his director's instructions. He made 30 films, most of them being B-movies, and before beginning his military service in April 42. He enlisted in the United States Army Reserve and was assigned as a private in Des Moines' 322nd Cavalry Regiment and reassigned to 2nd Lieutenant in the Officers Reserve Corps. He later became a part of the 323rd Cavalry Regiment in California. And as relations between the United States and Japan worsened, he was ordered to active duty while he was filming a movie called King's Row. Eventually, he would transfer to the United States Army Air Forces, and he became an AAF public relations officer. As a part of his job, he produced over 400 training films while he was serving. Now, here is where you start to see some of his later propensity for stretching the truth come to light. He used to tell stories about being a U.S. Army photographer that was assigned to film Nazi death camps, but it has been revealed that Ronald Reagan never even visited any such camps. So you start to see what made him, the type of skills that made him so good at politics. He was discharged on December 9th, 1945. From here, he became the president of the Screen Actors Guild and was elected to that position in a special election. As the president of the Screen Actors Guild, he was central in the Hollywood Blacklist and the Taft-Hartley Act implementation. The FBI interviewed Reagan, and he provided them with the names of actors that he believed to be communist sympathizers. If you listen to this show, you know that I think it was last year or the year before that, I actually talked about Scandalize My Name, which is a really great documentary. I suggest everybody watch it, where so many black actors in Hollywood, like Harry Belafonte, like Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, and so many others, actually had their careers damaged by people like Ronald Reagan, who were accusing them of being communist because they stood up for civil rights for black people. And at that point, civil rights was considered a Russian plant. Martin Luther King was called a Russian plant. Rosa Parks was called a Russian plant. They were all called communist. If you go online, you can see a lot of pictures of people holding signs that say race mixing is communism. And so this is where Ronald Reagan starts to reveal some of his more fascistic leanings. He actually testified that some guild members were associated with the Communist Party. Now, he started off as a Democrat. He was still a Democrat here, technically. He viewed FDR as a true hero. He said that. He said he viewed FDR as a true hero. He worked with the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor, to fight right-to-work laws like the horrible ones we have here in the state of Indiana that exploit workers and drive down wages for workers. He continued to speak out against racism when he was in Hollywood. So at first he starts off as sort of a liberal with some fascistic leanings, working with the AFL-CIO, having somewhat of a progressive view on civil rights at first. He appeared in a radio program called Operation Terror to speak out against the Ku Klux Klan and cited attacks by the group as capably organized systemic campaign of fascist violence and intimidation and horror. Now, he began to shift to the right when he supported the presidential campaigns of Eisenhower in 1952 and Richard Nixon in 1960. He would give speeches all over the country in favor of free markets, which is something, as you guys know, for the rest of his life would become sort of a thing. In these speeches, he would often criticize Medicare. In his view, legislation would have meant the end of individual freedom in the United States. This is always one of those things that conservatives say, well, Medicare and universal health care and those things lead to into individual freedom, as if having mounting bills, health bills, medical bills, is freedom. You want to know what freedom isn't? Freedom is not being unable to quit your job because you're afraid you're going to lose your health insurance. Freedom is not losing your home and having to file bankruptcy because you got cancer or because you broke your leg or because you had some sort of horrific accident. That's not freedom. But somehow conservatives have deduced in their head that that's what freedom is, usually because they have enough wealth that it's not really an issue for them. In 1964, he began to campaign for Barry Goldwater, who was running against LBJ at the time. In 1966, he announced his candidacy for California's governorship. And here he started repeating his stances on individual freedom and big government. When he met with black Republicans in March, he was criticized for opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and later argued that certain provisions of the act infringe upon the rights of property owners. So here we are now. We see Reagan's more racist and classist views starting to peek their head as he opposed the Civil Rights Act, and he's criticizing and opposing Medicare. He's supporting somebody like Barry Goldwater. But he did indeed win the governorship with 57% over incumbent Governor Pat Brown. Now, as the governor of California, he gave Californians the biggest tax hike in their history and somehow got away with it. Taxes on sales, banks, corporate profits, inheritances, liquor, cigarettes jumped. In one of his more infamous moves, he reacted to the Black Panther Party's strategy of cop watching by signing the Mulford Act that prohibited the public carrying of firearms. This act was California's restrictive piece of gun control legislation. Now, how many people listening knew that some of the very first gun control measures taken were by Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party? That's not, and the NRA actually supported it. Now, what that shows you is that the NRA, the Republican Party, people like Ronald Reagan, they will support gun control when it's about disarming black people who are trying to defend themselves against police brutality and racism. But God forbid, you know, some hick with an AR-15 goes and shoots up a black church, then that's not the time for gun control. It's not the time. We just need thoughts and prayers here. Black Panthers want to defend themselves. Lock those niggas up. In 1969, he declared a state of emergency in response to ongoing protests and acts of violence at the University of California, Berkeley, and sent in the California Highway Patrol. In May, these officers, along with the officers from Berkeley and Alameda County, clashed with protesters over a site known as the People's Park. One student was shot and killed, while many police officers and 2 reporters were injured. Reagan then commanded the state National Guard troops to occupy Berkeley for 17 days. Reagan defended his policies regarding campus protests, saying, "If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement." Wow. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but college in California used to basically be free until Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan specifically saw that young people who are educated would not support the war in Vietnam and were pro-civil rights. And so what he said was, and what the people around him said was, these young people are too educated. And so from that moment on, the cost of college in California and through the rest of the country became more costly and prohibitive for one reason, and one reason only: because they don't want young people to be educated enough to not join the military, oppose the military-industrial complex, and to support things that they view as being pro-civil rights or being anti-establishment. That was the only reason. They wanted to stop anti-establishment views from flourishing, and so that is why your kids are going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to college. Reagan's governorship saw public schools deteriorate due to his opposition of additional basic education funding. And all that talking he did about getting tough on crime didn't even matter. The homicide rate doubled under Ronald Reagan in California. Armed robbery rates escalated as well during his 8 years as governor, even with many laws that Reagan signed to try to toughen criminal sentencing and reform the criminal justice system. You don't fight crime with mass incarceration, folks. You don't fight crime by getting tough on crime. This is something that they've known for a very long time. Do you guys know that when America brought back the death penalty in 1976, do you know that the murder rate continued to skyrocket for the next 17 years afterwards? So even with the death penalty being on the table, people didn't stop murdering people. You educate people. You house the homeless. You make sure the poor are not desperate. That's how you deal with crime. That's how Europeans deal with it. You look at the happiest and healthiest countries in the world, that's how they deal with it. That's why they don't have the crime problems we have. I've done segments on Denmark and a lot of things that they've done to ameliorate the homelessness situation and why they the happiest and healthiest country in the world. None of it is mass incarceration. Let me get this caller real quick. Hello, caller.
Good evening. How are you?
Hey, what's up?
So everything that you've just discussed, there was one bottom line on all of it, and that was to put blacks and browns in jail.
Yep.
That's what it was all about. It wasn't about any of what they said, the war on crime, the war on drugs. All of it was to make another way to send more of us to jail. That's what it was about. Okay, that's all I'm wanting to say.
It's all good. Thank you for your call, and I agree with you 100%, sister. The entirety of the war on drugs, we talked about Richard Nixon when we did the segment on Richard Nixon being one of America's greatest villains. He started the war on drugs in 1973, and this isn't me saying it. This is not me saying it. This is one of his aides, John Ehrlichman. Look him up. He said Nixon hated hippies and Nixon hated blacks. And if we have a war on drugs, we can use that to lock them up in mass. We can disrupt their communities. We can throw their leaders in jail, harass their leaders. And that is the whole impetus for the war on drugs. Now, Nixon and Reagan were simpatico. Both were former governors of California. I played the phone call here of Nixon and Reagan talking about black people before. This is Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon talking about black people.
A Ronald Reagan from 1971 has raised questions about the former president's views on race.
On the morning of October 26, 1971, Reagan called up President Nixon at the White House.
Hello, Mr. President. Hope I didn't get you out of bed. No, I'm...
Their 12-minute chat was captured on President Nixon's White House tapes and was released in full by the National Archives just last month. It includes Governor Reagan using a racist slur to describe a group of African diplomats at the United Nations.
Last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did. Yeah. To see those monkeys from those African countries. Damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Reagan was reacting to this UN session the day before, where the U.S. lost major votes over the rise of China and whether communist China should be seated as the official Chinese delegation.
Those monkeys look uncomfortable wearing shoes. The two men right there, Nixon and Reagan, laughing about monkeys looking uncomfortable wearing shoes. Those are the people that are most responsible, along with our current president, Joe Biden, and Bill Clinton as well, for the mass incarceration of black men in this country. Nixon and Reagan came first. Nixon started it, Reagan amped it up. And you hear what they think about black people in that phone conversation. Those monkeys look uncomfortable wearing shoes. Now, after his term in office in California, he decided he was going to run for president for 1976. He announced his campaign on November the 20th, 1975. And this campaign is important because this is where the welfare queen in a Cadillac story came from. This is when Reagan starts telling that racist story. He talks about a Chicago welfare queen who had 80 aliases and had gotten $150,000 in welfare. But guess what, folks? This woman didn't exist. There was no welfare queen who had aliases and gotten $150,000 in welfare. He's talking about Linda Taylor. Well, the closest thing to that would be Linda Taylor. She received $8,000. Linda Taylor did. Still, Ronald Reagan continued for years to tell the story about the black welfare queen in the Cadillac. And even though he did not win The Republican nomination in 1976, it definitely set the tone for what was to come. All right, folks, we are not done talking about Ronald Reagan as one of America's greatest villains. Oh, Lord, no, we are not done. We have a whole nother segment to go with that. But that's going to be later on. As of right now, when we come back, happy happies!